Well, good evening or good afternoon, depending on where you are. And thanks so much for taking the time to spend the next hour with us as we dig into episode number 35 of EV Society's Canada Talks Electric Cars. Many of us have experienced it firsthand, or at least heard stories about the severe shortage of electric vehicles at car dealerships across Canada. While demand for EVs has been increasing, inventory on dealer lots has gone in the opposite direction. Adding to this story is the potential trend away from the traditional dealership model to direct sales by manufacturers. Recently, Dunsky Energy undertook a deep dive into the situation to uncover some of the kind of really interesting results, I think, and trends in this particular area. But before I introduce Jeff, uh, I'd like to do a short poll with the audience just to take everyone's temperature and see what you're thinking about uh, the car dealership world. So I'm hoping that everybody can see the poll. Yeah. So I'll let you go at it. I've asked a number of questions here, and I am going to read them out loud because when we publish the recording of this episode, you won't be able to see this poll in the recording. So the questions we're asking is which best describes your own dealership experience? The options are, I'm on a wait list for an EV at a dealership now. I want to buy an EV, but can't wait, so I'll buy an ICE for now. Or I found an EV in stock at a dealership and I bought it. Next option is I'm waiting to buy an EV until there's more choice on the lot, I guess, so you can kick the tires a little bit. Finally, I ordered from a dealer and I waited over a month for delivery. And then, of course, none of the above. The second question that the poll asks today is, just about your own view about car dealerships in general. What's your view on it? And you've got three options. One is I prefer buying a car directly from the manufacturer. Second option is I'm satisfied with the existing dealership model. And the final is I think buyers really should have the option to do it either way. So as I look at this, about 73% of the room have already voted and they're still coming in or quickly climbing. So we'll just let it roll a little bit longer and then I'll share the results with everybody. Okay, I think we fit a pretty good number. We're up to about 88% of the room. So I'm going to end the poll right here and I'll turn it around so that you can all see what the responses were. So first one, I'm on a wait list for an EV right now from a dealership. So about 13% of the room is in that situation. Next one, I want to buy an EV but can't wait and I'll buy an ICE for now instead. Not many people, one person in the entire room went that route. But it can happen. I found my EV in stock at a dealer and I bought it. So almost 10% of the room fit into that category. So people are finding cars here and there. I'm waiting to buy an EV until there's more choice on the lot. 15% makes some sense. I ordered from a dealer and I waited over a month for my delivery. 26%, over a quarter of the room went through that experience. And finally, about a third of the room didn't fall into any of those categories, maybe not in the market at all, who knows. But so that's kind of interesting. It looks like there are a lot of patient people. The last two questions, so what's your view of car dealerships in general? Well, about 40% of the room said they'd prefer to buy a car directly from the manufacturer. And interestingly, 10%, 9% would prefer the existing dealership model. And then finally, about half the room think, why not? We should be able to do both. So thanks for that. That sets the backdrop for the rest of this presentation. Appreciate your participation in that. So Jeff Turner, he's a director of mobility for Dunsky Energy, and he's a returning guest to the webinar. He was with us well over a year ago, and I think his talk was debunking myths and misconceptions about electric vehicles. So he's going to be providing some context really to Dunsky's recent study of EV dealerships and the inventory of electric vehicles across Canada. Jeff's passion for clean mobility and advanced energy technologies has led to a career at the nexus of sustainable transportation, energy storage, demand response, and renewable energy. His experience, more than a decade working with vehicle manufacturers, research institutes, utilities, and governments, affords him a unique, grounded perspective on what is needed to move the needle on market adoption of clean energy technologies. Jeff's work has covered personal and commercial vehicle engineering, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, energy storage technology, vehicle grid integration, among others. Jeff is, of course, a recognized leader in the transition to electrification. And we're really fortunate to have him. Jeff, welcome aboard. Glad to have you back.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tim. And thanks for the opportunity to speak with all of you.
Well, yeah, well, you have a lot of experience. Dunsky, as a company, I've come to really know and respect over the last few years, really involved in so many key aspects of electrification and electric cars, just doing really good work. So yeah, so that's great. Let's hear what they found when they dug into the whole dealership.
Sure, that sounds great. Well, yeah, this is an exciting topic. Really excited to have a chance to dive into it with all of you. We've been doing this analysis with Transport Canada for a few years, and it always gets lots of attention. So I think it's really helpful to get a chance to actually present it and provide some of the critical context to help understand what we found when collecting this data. I'll just start with a bit of an introduction to Dunsky. If you're like me, you probably haven't heard much of Dunsky before. You know, we're a relatively small firm. We're about 50 people, entirely based in Canada, headquarters in Montreal, offices in Toronto, Vancouver, and a few other staff scattered throughout the country. And essentially, we work on analysis and strategy that's 100% focused on the clean energy transition. We break this down into a few topic areas that we focus on. And most of the firm's history actually was founded around energy efficiency in buildings. And so actually, when I joined the firm 6 years ago, that was part of our move into the clean mobility space. And so it's been really exciting just watching, you know, transportation electrification in particular really taking off over that time period. And there's lots of work to do all over the continent. So, you know, most of the time we're working with typical clients include governments, utilities, also other organizations that are trying to figure out their role in the energy transition. And yeah, you can see we're really working coast to coast across North America. And what I find personally really exciting is just how many organizations are really grabbing the bull by the horns on the topic of transportation electrification and yeah, just really figuring out what role they can play to help move things forward. I thought it'd be helpful to give a little bit of context. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the types of projects that we do in electric mobility, just because it can sort of help provide some context for this analysis, which is all focused on EV availability, just because we know that there's a lot of complicated pieces to this puzzle that we need to figure out. So I'll just give a small sample of some of the projects that we've done in the past couple of years. Obviously, a lot of work in the province of Quebec. It's one of the leading jurisdictions in electric mobility. So I really enjoy getting a chance to work with the Quebec government, modeling potential adoption of EVs, helping them establish the ZEV targets for the province. And more recently, we've been developing an EV infrastructure strategy for the province. And so really figuring out how much charging infrastructure is needed to support those targets. We also do a lot of work with electric utilities in just about every province. So sometimes these are utilities that are trying to understand what is the likely impact of EVs on their systems, doing load forecasting, things like that. Other times utilities are trying to figure out what role they can play to sort of influence that load and potentially optimize when charging happens through things like smart charging and even vehicle to grid in some cases. And other times it's utilities that actually, recognize that EVs, if we can make sure that we manage that peak load impact, we can turn these things into an overall net benefit for the grid. And so some utilities in Canada are actually trying to figure out what role they can play to accelerate adoption of EVs and accelerate this transition, which is pretty exciting. We also do a lot of work with municipal governments across the country. We developed Toronto's EV strategy a few years back. have been working with other cities like Halifax, Victoria, Vancouver, Montreal. Municipal governments obviously have a really important role to play, especially just given some of the challenges related to charging infrastructure in those dense urban environments. And so it's been really interesting to see how that, how different cities across the country are tackling this challenge. And of course, a lot of work with the federal government. So I'll be talking about some of the work that we did with Transport Canada, but in parallel, we also do a lot of work with Natural Resources Canada on their various initiatives related to charging infrastructure. So we've been helping them understand, overall what's needed across Canada in terms of the number of different types of charging infrastructure, and also trying to understand how technology is evolving, things like the shift towards higher power charging levels, and challenges around medium and heavy duty vehicles as well. So it's been really exciting for me just to see that this is a lot of challenges to tackle across the country, but there are a lot of major organizations and institutions that are really throwing their weight behind this in a big way. And so it's really exhilarating to see that happening over the past few years. A lot of this work is anchored around our EV adoption model. We develop jurisdiction-specific forecasts of EV adoption, trying to account for all the different things that we know can impact the pace for adoption. Sometimes helping them, our clients, understand what role they can play and what kind of an impact they can expect through different interventions like financial incentives, infrastructure deployment, and building code requirements. And really use this kind of quantitative analysis to help them figure out what they should be doing. But sort of underneath all of this, analysis that we do, a constant theme over the past many years has been, trying to understand to what extent folks are able to actually get their hands on an EV. Because we're doing all this work to make sure folks are aware of EVs, or reassured that there's charging infrastructure where they need it. But this doesn't do us any good if folks can't just simply walk into a dealership and take one for a test drive. We have found that, over the past, I would say even 10 years, I remember meetings with Electric Mobility Canada back when I was based in BC, working with BC Hydro. This question of availability of EVs has been coming up for, easily over 10 years. And there's been a lot of debate, a lot of discussion about stories of folks waiting on wait lists, having a hard time finding EVs. But I think throughout this time, there's a recognition that there wasn't much data to work with. There's a lot of stories, but not much data on what's actually happening on the ground. And so that's when Transport Canada realized that it would be really beneficial to actually have quantified analysis, real data, to really back up these discussions and try to help inform some of the policy development that's currently ongoing across the country. So we've been working with Transport Canada since about 2018. Some of this actually has its roots in some analysis that the good folks over at Fleet Karma, now Geotab, did back, I think, around 2015. And so we sort of picked up the ball from them when we realized it would be helpful to continue doing this kind of analysis. And really sort of spending the past 5 years now really getting into the weeds of how many EVs are available across the country. So the reports that we've done on this topic, we've been publishing them publicly. You can find them on our website. If you just go to the news section and filter for mobility, you'll see news articles anytime that we've posted one of the updates for this analysis. Most of what I'll be presenting today is just what was included in the 2022 report that summarized data from March of 2022. But it's worth mentioning that we're continuing to do more of this analysis. Obviously, this is something that evolves over time, and it's great to get a snapshot in time of what inventory looked at a given time. But we know that this is something that's evolving and impacted by a number of factors. So really interesting to see how the data has evolved from one report to the next. I'll just talk a little bit about the approach here. So what we're tracking here is availability of EVs in dealerships. So essentially, we're talking about dealership inventory. Now, I'll talk a little bit later how, I think we have examples of how you don't necessarily need dealership lots full of cars to sell EVs. But, in the meantime, we know that there are dealerships across the country that do stock vehicles, and there are folks that purchase their vehicles by going down to their local dealership and seeing what's available. So our approach for this project was to collect this data via two approaches. One is that, fortunately, a number of automakers actually make this inventory data available through their website. And so it's just a question of working with tools to collect that data via their websites and compile that into one database. For the remainder of the auto industry, the other automakers, though, that don't make that data available on their websites, it's a little bit more tricky. So some individual dealerships might have their own online inventory websites, but what we do here is just really do the brute force approach of picking up the phone and calling literally over 1,000 dealerships across the country. So we partner with a firm that's really efficient at this type of phone data collection, and yeah, it's time intensive, but we get the work done in a matter of a couple of weeks, and that's how we're able to paint a pretty complete picture of what the inventory looks like across the country. Now, it's worth mentioning, a few caveats. Of course, the data that we get is only as good as we can trust these sources. So, if you're collecting data off of a website, there's no real guarantee that those vehicles are actually on the lot. Likewise with phone calls, we're basically taking their word for it that the vehicles that they say are in stock are actually there, and that's just one of the limitations of this approach. We have seen some other studies done in other parts of the world that actually recruit folks to actually go to dealerships in person and act as secret shoppers. And, they can get a more fulsome report on what that EV shopping experience is like. And so that's really an interesting approach. Obviously, it's a little bit more time and resource intensive. So I think there's a lot of value in this sort of broad approach that maybe doesn't go quite as deep into each dealership, but really gets us a picture of what's happening across the country. It's also important to appreciate that, there's the electric mobility landscape across Canada is continuing to evolve. Some of our earlier reports back in 2018, 2019, there was a lot of flux, things like, we used to have a rebate program for purchase incentives in Ontario that was canceled fairly suddenly. And, that can have a big impact on the pace of sales and inventory buildup at dealerships. Likewise, in 2019, we saw the introduction of the federal incentive. So, new policies like this, ongoing investment in charging infrastructure across the country, that really has a big impact on this overall landscape. So, any of our reports, we make a point of painting that picture, helping understand what's happening in the electric mobility world in Canada at the time of these studies. But the overall trend, as I'm sure we're all aware, is pretty steady growth in the EV market in Canada. Some ups and downs along the way. You can see that the data is a little bit stale here. This is from our report that was for March 2022, so we're looking back at 2021 data. But I think we've seen 2022 EV market share is up around 9% now in Canada. So the trend towards accelerating uptake of EVs is pretty obvious. We know where this is going, and so it's just been really interesting to get a sense of how inventory is keeping pace with that increased demand. Now, all that said, we know that there are a lot of challenges around the EV supply chain, and where we have found over time that EV inventory has been somewhat limited. 2022 was a pretty challenging year across the auto industry. So anybody who went to a car dealership, whether looking for an EV or any kind of car, would have found pretty limited inventory back in the earlier part of 2022. And so, there are specific constraints in the supply chain. There was a lot of pent-up demand after the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we know that was having impacts across the industry, not just for ZEVs. And on top of that, there's also just the question of evolving retail models. So you don't need to look any further than Tesla to understand that you don't necessarily need, dealership lots full of EVs across the country to be able to sell a lot of EVs. There are a number of automakers that are shifting to more of a custom order approach. And so that raises the question of how critical is dealership inventory to really enable this uptake of EVs. So we know it's not the only piece of the puzzle, but that said, there are folks who are still, buying vehicles the way they have for in the past, and that involves, walking through a lot of vehicles that are on display and maybe taking one home if they find one that meets their needs. So it's really kind of tricky to understand how to interpret this data, but I think one thing that's really helpful, of course, is just tracking progress over time. The first few reports that we did, we'd get all this data and it was kind of hard to understand, what did this really mean? But now that we've done this data collection a number of times, it really helps us see how things are tracking over time and try to assess whether there are challenges in the market that might be slowing things down. So I'll spend the next few slides just showing a few of the key takeaways for me, or some of the findings rather, a couple different ways to look at the data and break it down according to provinces and automakers and things like that. But just to start, This is the graph that just shows the total Canada-wide EV inventory across the country. I'll just pause right there. I realize that I'm sort of flip-flopping between the terms EV and ZEV, zero-emission vehicles. Really, I should have included some definitions here, but what we're looking for here are zero-emission vehicles, including battery electric vehicles, plug-in hybrids. Fuel cell electric vehicles technically fit the definition, but we haven't actually tracked any in inventory up till now. We'll see if those start to factor in future studies, but for now, I'll just be using the term EV and ZEV sort of interchangeably. But you can see that March 2022, yeah, was pretty clearly a big step back in the availability of EVs. We were, seeing pretty steady inventory for a number of years. Started to see significant improvements in 2020 and 2021 before the significant drop in 2022. And in fact, it was the lowest amount of EVs that we tracked ever since we started collecting this data. Now, as I mentioned, there are a number of factors at play here that are impacting the availability of vehicles across the industry. But I think, given that EV inventory has always been a little bit limited over the years, this reduction is a kind of a discouraging blow to some of the momentum that we saw building in the market. And yeah, definitely eager to see how this is tracking over time as we continue to track availability. Breaking this down by province, of course, it's a big country. Provinces are, it's not straightforward to compare Ontario to Prince Edward Island. So we like to present things normalized according to population. So you can see even when looking at this on a per capita basis, EVs per 100,000 people, it's pretty clear that BC and Quebec really punch above their weight. There are a number of factors at play. Those markets are much more mature. They also have a number of supportive policies, incentives, and ZEV mandates. And you can really sort of see that as evidenced by the event availability that's in those provinces. That said, in 2022, there was a pretty significant drop and across the country. Although I find it kind of encouraging to see that, places like Atlantic Canada, there's been, it was pretty dire for the first few years when we were doing this analysis. But those provinces are starting to see more availability, at least when sort of normalized to this on a population basis. This table, it's a bit of an eye chart, but it can give you really a fulsome picture of what's happening across the country. So really broken down province by province, automaker by automaker. So you can really see who's pulling their weight on infrastructure. On availability of EVs in dealerships. Right, maybe great moment to show that, there's Tesla sitting right there with only 16 EVs available across the country. So, a clear reminder that EV availability and inventory isn't everything here. But clearly, some automakers are putting a lot of effort into making sure that there's a decent number of vehicles. Some of the American automakers really stood out this round as having decent availability across the country. That said, you can also see some automakers that are very clearly prioritizing some markets. So I think Ford stands out as one example. You can even see this in some of their advertisement when they say some models are only available in certain provinces. And this is borne out in a number of the data collection rounds that we've seen where, some provinces are getting all the love and others are being left with a much smaller number of vehicles to choose from. This snapshot gives you a sense of how things have evolved in terms of the diversity of automakers. February 2021 to me was very encouraging because it was such a good mix. So many different automakers really participating in the market, providing a lot of availability across the country. So this is these pie charts represent what percentage of the overall total inventory across the country is represented by each automaker. And this most recent snapshot in March 2022 showed sort of a reversal of that trend, with over 80% of the available inventory being spread out across only 4 brands. So that really highlights how it really took a big step back. And there are a couple players like Toyota, for example, who had one of the highest, I think they're 4th place in inventory numbers in 2021. And March 2022, they really had a lot of challenges getting vehicles in dealerships. And I think we actually saw 0 EVs from Toyota at that stage. So it's also worth highlighting how much this can fluctuate from snapshot to snapshot. Where it'd be really interesting to see what this data looks like if we were able to collect it on an ongoing basis. Fluctuate. from round to round. This plot shows just how the diversity of models really plays out in each province. I think overall, one thing that's been really encouraging in doing this analysis is seeing how many more models there are in theory in the market. The latest round, we're doing more analysis on this front with Transport Canada as we speak, and the number of models that are available today, it's frankly making this analysis more and more complex with every year compared to the first few times when there was only a dozen different models to track. That said, that availability doesn't necessarily pan out in practice when it comes down to what vehicles are actually available on those dealership lots. And you can see that there's a bit of a discouraging trend there in terms of the number of models available in 2022 being consistently below what's been available in the past few years. And back to my point about, the encouraging improvements in places like Atlantic Canada on a per capita basis. But when you see that what that means is, really we have 3 different models of EV available in Prince Edward Island, you can see how that might be having an impact on the potential uptake if there's just not as much diversity in the types of EVs that folks are able to shop for in that province. It's also helpful to have a look at this on sort of a dealership basis, trying to understand what percentage of dealerships have EVs in stock. And we've certainly seen a number of automakers over the years who have really done a good job on this front, making sure that they have at least one EV in each dealership. But this has really started to drop off, and due to the supply constraints that we saw that were particularly pronounced in 2022. It's also clear here that there are some automakers that aren't necessarily spreading out that availability across all of their dealerships. So in particular, some of the American automakers, their dealerships were pretty consistently around 20 to 40% of them would have EVs in stock. And there's a pretty good portion of them that just didn't have any EVs whatsoever. So that's really interesting trend. Some folks might point to this being, a question about urban versus rural deployment, understanding that some markets are really, pretty heavy on SUVs and pickup trucks that we're only now seeing come to the market. So hopefully this is something that we can see change over time as more and more of the automotive segments have EV options to choose from. I find it really helpful to really just sum this up. To me, this is one of the key takeaways in terms of the percentage of dealerships across the country that have EVs in stock. And here again, you can see how much of a turn for the worse things took in March 2022, with 82% of dealerships in Canada not having any EVs in stock at all. And of those that did have some stock, a bunch of those only had 1 or 2 EVs available. So that was a big setback from, but even in previous years, we never really saw much more than, say, not even half of dealerships with EVs in stock. It's always been a majority of dealerships across the country in every data round that we've collected that have had, the majority of dealerships have had 0 EVs in stock. And, there are a number of different ways to slice and dice this data, but I think that is a pretty telling outcome here. To me, if the chances are that if you go into any dealership in Canada, chances are it's not going to have any EVs available for you to test drive or look at, let alone take one home and buy it. And I think it's hard to see how that isn't likely to have an impact on the potential for EV adoption in the country. You can see how that varies from province to province. Obviously, things are looking a bit better in places like Quebec and BC. BC with 30% of dealerships having at least one EV in stock. But other provinces like Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, where it's less than 10% of dealerships that had EVs in stock. Now, again, this is significantly worse. We saw better numbers than this in February 2021. I'm hoping that we'll see an improvement again when we collect more data for future analysis of Transport Canada. But yeah, that was a pretty dire situation there in March 2022. Now, for those dealerships that don't have any EVs in stock, we also ask how long it would take to get one. So, and this is becoming increasingly important. I think this aspect will be really important if we see more of a shift towards custom orders. Really, we could imagine a future where it's not important necessarily to have a vehicle on the lot that you can walk up and buy when you like what you see. But that only works, that kind of custom order model only works if the wait times are reasonable. And what we saw when we asked those dealerships that had no EVs in stock, the vast majority of them said it would be at least 3 months, if not 6 months or more, to get your hands on an EV. I credit Cara Clareman with Plug and Drive for highlighting one aspect of these wait times is that, if folks are signing up, getting on multiple wait lists and just waiting for whichever one comes in first, that might mean that these wait lists are inflated a little bit by folks who will cancel their order if one model comes in before the other. But I think this is something that we're going to want to keep tracking because I don't know. I myself, I waited 6 months for my Chevy Bolt back in 2018. That works for me. I knew what I wanted, but it really makes me wonder how much the average person is willing to wait for a car. So anyway, I'll leave it at that in terms of the data and the graphs. I know it can be a little bit overwhelming, but for me, I think some of the key takeaways, I mean, it's pretty clear at this point that March 2022 was a real significant setback in terms of EV availability. Now, but again, you can't ignore the fact that it was a tough year for any type of vehicle across the auto industry. So that's really the important context to keep in mind there. But that said, I think when we know that EV availability was already pretty limited, starting from a pretty shaky ground, that drop is only more dire when we know that it was already only 50% of dealerships that had any EVs in stock. So that drop is, I think, felt pretty. It's a pretty pronounced drop for the limited EV availability that was already out there. On top of that, the distribution of EVs is pretty uneven across the country. And, so we might have some automakers that are moving more towards an online retailing approach. And it's not clear that, we're always going to need to have dealership lots full of EVs to enable this transition. But for those that are looking to buy a vehicle off the lot, we know it's pretty clear to us that they're going to need to be pretty patient because, the vast majority of these dealerships do not have any EVs in stock, and those that don't have any, the wait time is pretty significant. So I think this is something we want to keep tracking and make sure that we're seeing some progress on this front. We know that automakers are making significant investments on this front, and it's just really going to be a question of to what extent that supply of vehicles is going to be able to keep pace with demand that we know is accelerating across the country as everyone becomes more and more convinced that an EV is going to be a good fit for them. So I'll leave it at that. Really excited to see that there's a bunch of questions in the Q&A. But besides that, if anybody wants to reach out, has any questions about this study that you'd like to continue the discussion, my email address is there. Always happy to have a chat about this stuff. But yeah.
And Jeff, I'll chat with you after, and we'll put your email address and maybe a couple of website links into the notes for the recording of this, so people can find you or maybe download the report that you're detailing here tonight.
That sounds great.
Awesome. Well, great job. I don't know whether I should be depressed or. I guess the positive way to look at it is that this year is going to be a lot better, and that I expect that it will just get better every year from this point on.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but
I think it's a pretty. I don't think anybody of us were predicting global pandemic back a few years ago, so it's pretty extreme circumstances that we've seen reverberating throughout many industries. But yeah, I think we're all really hopeful. Like I said, it's pretty exciting how hard and more complex this job is getting, just as there are so many more models coming to market, and from just about every automaker at this point. So it's lots of choice and lots of data to track.
That would have been interesting, maybe I don't think you would have looked for this info, but just to see what the total car inventory, including ICE, was from year over year and month over month.
Absolutely. Yeah, it became pretty clear there when we were seeing the impacts really settle in across the industry, that it would have been really helpful to be tracking some inventory levels for other types of vehicles as well. And this is something that we'll be incorporating into future analysis to provide us with a few benchmarks so that we can really understand, what we're seeing with EVs and how that compares to what we're seeing with other types of vehicles.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's get you to turn off your screen share, and we'll bring Jason Arnaud on board. Jason, I see we do have a bunch of questions, which is great. And would you mind taking us through a few of them?
No problem at all, Tim. So Jeff, first one, pretty obvious. This info is all at least a year old, if not older. Do you have any information on the trends that you've been seeing since then?
Yeah, I think there's only so much I can say at this stage. We're working with Transport Canada to continue the analysis. I think I'll just leave it at the fact that yes, we are seeing improvements compared to last year as we would have hoped. But yeah, still need a little bit more time to let the data sink in and for us to review what we found so far. But we're hopeful that should have some more to report on that in the coming months.
Okay, great. Another question, just clarifying early part of your presentation. Did you treat hybrids as ZEVs as well, or were they excluded?
Just plug-in hybrids, so not conventional hybrids, but we're specifically looking at plug-in electric vehicles in this analysis.
Okay, that makes sense. And next one, asking an opinion, are Tesla's dealership inventory numbers so low because of their direct sales model?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mentioned this a bit earlier, but yeah, from the start, Tesla has not had, hundreds of dealerships across the country like we see with some of the other automakers. They're working with, limited stores in a few major urban areas, and largely relying on folks that are coming in and making orders for custom orders. So I think we do see them. They do have some vehicles in inventory here and there, but clearly they're up and running pretty smoothly with that ordering process. And yeah, again, I think that's a clear reminder here that it's possible to sell EVs without a dealership lot full of vehicles. So that's not the only piece of the puzzle, but yeah, I think that's what we're seeing there with the data from Tesla.
Okay. The next one is a definite tangent from the topic of the webinar, but I think it's still in your wheelhouse. It's a comment saying, my answer to the survey is that, there are no charging stations within several hundred kilometers of where I live in northern Manitoba, so no one's going to buy an EV. How can we advocate to our utility to support an EV infrastructure? They also mentioned that they didn't see Manitoba Power on your map and was wondering if there was any involvement there.
Yeah, that gap is pretty glaring. It's actually outdated. We have been doing some pretty exciting work in Manitoba lately. I don't think anything's public on that front yet, but yeah, I think it's there's a lot of potential in Manitoba with pretty clean grid there, and a number of stakeholders are pretty eager to see this move forward. So yeah, there's definitely a chicken and egg situation on charging infrastructure. A lot of the work that we do is just really comes from the fact that there's a pretty limited business case for investing in charging infrastructure until there's enough vehicles on the road that utilization is going to drive a potentially a profitable business case in some circumstances for public charging infrastructure. So our view is that it's really important for governments, and in particular utilities, to play a role in sort of breaking through that chicken and egg situation. I think utilities are in a very unique position to recognize a broader business case for charging infrastructure that doesn't necessarily rely on that infrastructure to be profitable as a standalone business, but rather, utilities can recognize revenue wherever folks are charging their vehicles. And so whether that's, utilities like Hydro-Quebec who are directly investing in their own charging infrastructure, or potentially utilities offering incentives for third parties and other businesses to deploy charging. I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle to break through that chicken and egg situation. But on that front, I think tying back to what we're tracking here, we've worked with a number of major organizations across the country who are looking to invest in charging infrastructure. And they're asking themselves whether they can justify it if they know that it's so hard for folks to actually buy vehicles. And there have been situations where it's been at risk. Their plans to move forward with more investment in charging infrastructure were in doubt because they knew that EVs were so limited in availability in their jurisdiction. So I think that's another aspect of the chicken and egg situation here, is that increased availability of vehicles is going to help create a little bit more certainty around the need and the potential profitability of charging infrastructure investments across the country.
Okay, thank you. This is another charging question. When you work with utilities, what are the daily average, EV charging kilowatt hour requirements that they're using? Because they've seen projections where utilities are expecting a full charge every night, which isn't really practical.
That's not realistic. Yeah, I love this because it's a really easy rule of thumb to keep in mind. It's about 10 kilowatt hours a day based on average daily kilometers traveled for most vehicles, based on typical vehicle efficiency assumptions. So it's a nice rule of thumb to be able to keep in mind. 10 kilowatt hours a day per EV, maybe a little bit more than that if it's a pickup truck. Obviously, much more than that if you're talking about medium and heavy duty vehicles. But for light duty vehicles, yeah, 10 kilowatt hours is about right on a daily basis. And then, of course, there's the question of when is that power consumed? We do a lot of work that involves hourly load profiles for different types of charging to figure out, okay, it's one thing to understand how much energy is consumed in a 24-hour period, but what is the peak power draw from an EV across a population? And those are some of the key inputs that we work with on utilities just to try to figure out what is the likely impact on their systems.
And are you seeing utilities getting smarter about that and using more realistic numbers versus kind of, crazy inflated numbers?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, any of the utilities that we're working with, we're diving right into the nitty gritty here. We've got detailed assumptions on energy consumption by vehicle type, detailed hourly load profiles for different charging types. So the utilities that we're working with are certainly doing this with a little bit more rigor. And even the ones that we aren't working with, I'd say, it's compared to 10 years ago, back when I was at BC Hydro, and this was seeming much more theoretical at the time, and we were much smaller numbers in terms of the number of vehicles on the road. I think we're at a point now where this is very real, and utilities are getting better at thinking about what to plan for on the grid. Now, all that said, I think there's one thing to assess average impacts. One thing that we need to keep in mind in Canada is the impact of cold weather. And I think we've all seen it. EVs consume more energy in the winter, primarily due to keeping the driver warm. And what matters to utilities is what does it look like on the very coldest day of the year? Because that's if for the utilities in Canada, it's not all of them, but many of the utilities in Canada see their peak demand in the winter. And so what matters for them is how much energy is going to be consumed on that coldest day. And so, 24 kilowatt hours might be a bit of a stretch, but it can certainly, if you picture what your range is on the coldest day versus an average day in the summer, that can give you a sense of how much more energy is consumed by your vehicle. And that's pretty important to consider if you're focused on that peak load impact question.
Okay, back to EV sales. This is an interesting one. Will the exclusion of non-US EVs from the new US federal rebate potentially help the availability of these vehicles in Canada? For example, the Kia EV6 and Hyundai Ioniq 5. Do you think that inventory will get redirected?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that's what's at play here. Ultimately, we know that automaker plans for how many EVs to put into the market are decided at a global scale, and it's a global market. Certainly, there are sub-regions like we're obviously heavily impacted by our big neighbors to the south, and yeah, absolutely. There are a number of parts of the U.S. that have ZEV mandates in place that require automakers to hit certain targets. And then on top of that, there are the generous incentives. The US has had federal incentives for longer than Canada, and their incentives are more generous than what we have at the federal level in Canada. But if that suddenly is not available to some automakers south of the border, I think it's fair to say that might actually work in our favor if they're just suddenly seeing lower demand for those models due to the limited rebates available. So it's a complex system. There's a lot of factors at play here, but absolutely, I think what happens south of the border can have a big impact on what happens here in Canada. And those changing incentive conditions are really going to be a key factor at play here.
Okay. The next one is a little short, so it's up for interpretation. The question is, what are the stats for EVs sold via dealerships and online? I don't think you talked or touched on absolute numbers over the range of your study.
No, it's not something we studied. It's an obvious next question. I think getting a better sense of what portion of the market is going through that kind of factory order model versus through dealership inventory. We don't really have a good sense of that, but I think there's some automakers where it's really that's their bread and butter. Folks like Tesla and others, sort of some more niche products like Polestar and folks like that, and certainly a lot of the higher end models and luxury makes and models are more likely to go through that custom order approach. But yeah, it's not something where I've got any numbers at the tip of my fingers to pull out, but I think it's something that we definitely need to look at in the future.
Yeah, and Glenn, who asked this question, we also have on a monthly basis an online Zoom chapter meeting to go along with our webinar. And during that meeting, we do discuss sales for EVs in Canada and globally. So if you're interested in that kind of information, I encourage you to sign up for our monthly chapter meeting and attend a few of those.
Yeah, oh, that sounds great.
So the next one, sorry, these questions are jumping around a little bit. Next question, isn't most of these low inventory numbers due to the sales model shifting more from cars sitting on lots to online orders like Genesis, Tesla, and many others?
Yeah, I mean, I think I tried to address that in my presentation. That's obviously one of the trends that we're watching closely here. I wouldn't be able to say, yeah, whether that's most of the lack of inventory or not. I feel pretty confident that it's not, just because we've seen some of the more recent data and data before that. I think most of the big hit that we saw in March 2022 is more attributable to the global shock to supply chains, if I had to guess. But yeah, I think this question about the shift towards different sales models, we're seeing announcements from different automakers who are shifting that direction. I think Ford, Volvo have all made statements about future plans to shift more towards that kind of online sales model. But in the meantime, though, there are still hundreds of dealers, literally thousands of dealerships across the country that do have large lots full of vehicles. So, and yeah, just back to, these anecdotes, we know that there are a lot of folks out there who, in particular, I think of my parents' generation, who are more likely to, go down to the local dealership and see what they have on display. Their need for a vehicle is maybe a little bit more urgent. They're not necessarily able to wait 6 months for a vehicle, and they really want to just see what's available on the lot. So I think it is a pretty important trend, but I think it's probably too early to say that the inventory sales model approach is already gone. I think that's going to be with us for at least a number of years.
And that segues nicely into two of the next questions, where one of them is a comment saying that when I've checked Tesla's website for inventory in Toronto, there are always cars there. Until recently, there were almost 20 Model 3s. So even Tesla, who are famous for online ordering, are starting to keep cars in stock as well.
Yeah, we've seen that as well. Yeah, it's pretty telling.
The other related question is, of course, as you mentioned, supply chain issues, those being cited as the main reason for production being down across the board. Do you have a feeling that this is getting better for 2023?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear just based on industry reports that things are starting to get better. I don't know if we'll have a clear, yes, the shortage is over, or no, it's still ongoing. But yeah, I think we are getting a sense that the industry is recovering from those constraints, at least to a certain extent. And I'll just say, yeah, so far, preliminary results that we've seen so far on our latest data collection suggest that there's a fairly substantial rebound so far, which is encouraging.
Okay, there's a specific question about this study. Toyota Canada executives have said that your inventory studies have used cherry-picked data meant to push for a ZEV mandate. Have you heard this criticism from other OEMs, and what are your thoughts?
No, I wouldn't say we have. I mean, yeah, there's been certainly some criticism of this analysis. I'm familiar with the comments made by somebody from Toyota at one point. And I think, frankly, some of the criticisms are unfair and seem to be ignoring a lot of the careful context that we provide in our report, it might be more of a reaction to how, some secondary outlets might take our report and, publish their key takeaways, which might leave out some of that context. But I think if you go back to our report, I think, we're pretty proud of the work that we did here. And as I mentioned at the start of this, as far as our work goes, most often our clients are hiring us to help them think through challenges and come up with solutions. And that's not the case here. We were really asked to stay pretty objective, report on the numbers, and let the numbers speak for themselves. And frankly, yeah, I think there's a lot of room for interpretation on what these numbers mean. And so I think we've tried to stay pretty high level, stay, within our lane basically here in terms of reporting on the inventory numbers as they are, and let everybody take this data and figure out what to do with it without us necessarily opinionating on what we should do about these findings.
Yeah, I'll jump in there. That we did have a couple of episodes of the webinar dealing with ZEV mandates, and it's certainly a hot topic. Let's put it that way. That there is obviously on the side of the manufacturers, there's nobody likes to be told what to do, and that's essentially what happens in that scenario. But on the other side, there's a desire for change and to get things moving along, and so it's a bit of a carrot and a stick. Everyone loves the carrots, nobody likes the sticks. So I understand why you probably get a little bit of pushback, but
yeah,
again, you're doing your best, I think, to report on the numbers, and the numbers by and large speak for themselves. You can interpret them in different ways if you wish.
Yep.
But you just don't shoot the messenger, right?
No, I appreciate that. And I will say, my first few jobs in the industry, I used to work for automakers, and I've always been a car nut. I've been reading car magazines since I was a little kid. And in general, I'm just so encouraged at how much investment is going into the EV space now. It's clearly becoming a more competitive space where automakers are keen to pursue this segment of the market and do so vigorously. But I think it's possible to acknowledge that while still acknowledging that, right now, it seems like for folks who are shopping for an EV, the lack of availability is a challenge. There could be a number of sources or reasons for that. Maybe it's global supply chain issues that are affecting all vehicles. Maybe there are some issues that are specific to EVs, but either way, I think it's important for us to understand what's going down when folks are looking to actually get their hands on an EV, and to what extent that might be slowing down this transition.
Yeah. Jason, do we have another question maybe? And then I think we've been plowing through quite a few here. We don't want to stay on longer than our welcome.
Okay, I have one more. This is an interesting approach. Your study focused on inventory rather than sales throughput or registrations. And that seems to lead towards, looking at people that need to feel, kick the tires, experience an EV,
Yep.
versus people that know that they want an EV and just want to buy one.
Yeah.
Is that what you're really seeing?
I think, yeah, plenty of questions about to what extent is inventory important going forward in this world where, the number one EV automaker right now has very little inventory. That tells us that it's not critical to sell EVs. But I think the point that's raised by this person, this question, is all about the folks who aren't, on a webinar like this, who are pretty devoted to, pretty interested in EVs, interested enough to spend time on a weekday evening to listen all about it. What about all those folks who are maybe just curious about EVs, have heard a friend or relative talk about their experience, and are, it's time for them to shop for their vehicle. They go down to a dealership and want to see what there is. How important is it for those people to be presented with, a number of EVs in inventory that they can check out, maybe have a motivated salesperson that's actually trying to talk about the advantages of that vehicle over a nice vehicle. So I think that's exactly the kind of shopper that we're thinking about when we ask, how is inventory holding up across the country? Because yeah, there are folks out there who know they definitely want an EV. They're ready to get on a waiting list for exactly the model they want, and maybe wait 3-6 months or more to get their hands on one. But I think, yeah, my concern is really about the more mainstream folks who aren't yet convinced, We know that about, at least 9 in 10 new vehicle purchases in Canada right now are still gas-powered vehicles. So the question is, how many of those folks might have been swayed to buy an EV if they had been if they had seen a few compelling EV options on the dealer lot when they were shopping?
Yeah. I think it would also be interesting, and it's outside of the scope of your study, but to know what the attitudes are at dealerships across Canada, because we know when things started, there may have been a few enthusiasts, but a lot of the dealers, at least at the beginning, had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the EV space. And that doesn't bode well for a positive selling environment for folks coming in seriously looking. But I think in fairness, it's changed a lot. And while there may be a few holdouts, I think that, by and large, dealers want the inventory because they see they can sell them. Yeah. All right.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. There have definitely been some examples out there, dealerships who are really out ahead of this curve and eager to help bring those folks along the ride. So yeah, I think that's really a source of encouragement for me.
Yeah, well, great. Well, Jason, thanks for getting us through all those questions. Really appreciate that. And Jeff, really, once again, thanks so much for taking the time to putting some context around that report. Dunsky just continues to do great work, and we appreciate you giving up your a little bit of your weeknight time to come and tell us all about it. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a lot of fun. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for all the great questions.
Well, maybe we'll get you back a year from now when you have a fresh report, and we can all pat each other on the back about how great the numbers look.
Yeah, we'll cross our fingers.
Awesome. Okay, so the expected growth of electric vehicles and the associated energy demand from charging has the potential to break our electricity grid, or maybe revolutionize it. On our next episode of Canada Talks Electric Cars, we're going to get to hear from one industry expert, Matthew Sachs, and he's the Chief Operating Officer at Peak Power, about how vehicle to grid, or V2G, will help answer concerns about our electrical grid. So remember to mark that date. It's going to be on Tuesday, May 2nd, and always 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So on behalf of the entire webinar team at EV Society, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us on today's episode, and really for your continued support of this webinar. We really appreciate that. And from all of us at EV Society, and until next time, stay well. This concludes today's webinar.